premise: how Jake McNiece used Boy's anti-tank rifle in 1944 with calculated risk to stop an armored push. Untold, the hedgerow south of Sun had collapsed under shellfire hours earlier, leaving a gap wide enough for half-tracks to pour through if the Germans realized it was there. Jake McNiece crouched in the mud beside what remained of a stone farmhouse wall, staring at the thing his squad had dragged from a burned-out British supply truck. A Boy's anti-tank rifle, nearly 5 feet long, absurdly heavy, and according to every manual McNiece had ever ignored, completely obsolete against anything heavier than a scout car. The weapon's barrel was scratched and dented, the bipod legs bent slightly to one side. The .55 caliber rounds they'd scavenged from the wreckage were British issue, stamped 1942, and there were only 11 of them left in a canvas pouch that smelled like diesel and blood. McNiece had never fired one. He'd seen British anti-tank teams abandon them along the roads near Eindhoven 2 days earlier, trading them for Piats and bazookas that actually stood a chance against German armor. But explosives were gone. The TNT satchels scattered across the drop zone had been soaked through or buried under 2 feet of canal water when the 506th PIR hit the ground in chaos on September 17, 1944. The Filthy 13 had been tasked with holding the southern approach to Sun long enough for engineers to rig the bridge properly, but the engineers were pinned down a kilometer north, and German reconnaissance vehicles were already probing the tree line across the field. If they found the gap in the hedgerow, they'd push straight through to the bridge, and the entire operation to secure the road to Arnhem would collapse before it even began. McNiece ran his thumb along the rifle's cold steel receiver and thought about the math. The boys fired a .55 caliber armor-piercing round with enough velocity to punch through 21 millimeters of armor at 100 yards, if you believed the spec sheets. German half-tracks and armored cars had anywhere from 8 millimeters to 14 millimeters of frontal armor, depending on the model. Doable, barely, but the recoil was legendary. British gunners described it as getting kicked by a mule while lying on broken glass. Firing it without proper bracing could dislocate a shoulder or crack ribs. Firing it from an improvised position, standing or kneeling, was borderline suicidal. And yet, McNiece looked back at his squad. 7 paratroopers, faces streaked with mud and exhaustion, staring at him the way they always did when the situation turned impossible. Sergeant Ragsman, who jumped with a broken finger and taped it to his rifle. Dewey, barely 20, still picking bits of parachute silk out of his gear. Moore, who never spoke much but always stayed close when things got bad. They'd followed him through hedgerows and across canals, trusting his instincts over orders more times than McNiece cared to count. Now they were looking at him again, waiting for him to figure out something no one else would try. The sound of engines grew louder across the field. 2, maybe 3 vehicles, moving slowly through the fog that clung to the low ground near the canal. McNiece couldn't see them yet, but he knew the rhythm. German reconnaissance doctrine: probe, test, withdraw if met with resistance, call in armor if the route looked open. If they found the gap, they'd radio back, and within the hour, a full column of half-tracks and armored cars would roll through, cutting the 101st Airborne's line in half. McNiece had 11 rounds. He needed to make the Germans believe the route was a death trap, not a highway. He'd spent the last 10 minutes calculating angles, distances, and the sheer audacity required to pull off what he was considering. The Boys was designed to be fired from a prone position with the bipod planted firmly in the ground, the stock braced against the shoulder, and the shooter's body weight absorbing as much recoil as possible. McNiece didn't have that luxury. The collapsed hedgerow left no good firing positions. The farmhouse wall was too low for prone shooting. The only angle that gave him a clear line of sight across the field was a half-standing position, wedged into the corner of the wall, using the stone as partial bracing. It would work once, maybe twice. After that, the recoil would shatter something, his shoulder, the wall, or the rifle itself. But McNiece had learned long ago that the Filthy 13 didn't survive by following the manual. They survived by doing the thing no one else was crazy enough to try, and making it look deliberate afterward. The fog shifted, and McNiece saw the first vehicle, a German SDKFZ 222 armored car, turret swiveling as it scanned the hedgerows. Light armor, fast, exactly the kind of target the boys could handle if the round hit clean. Behind it, he could just make out the silhouette of a second vehicle, larger, probably a half-track carrying troops. McNiece wedged himself into the corner of the wall, pressed the stock against his shoulder, and braced his left elbow against the stone. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. His hands were shaking, not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from the cold and exhaustion that had been building since the night drop. He took a breath, held it, and sighted down the barrel at the armored car's front plate. This was the calculated risk. One shot to prove the route was defended, to make the Germans hesitate, to buy enough time for someone, engineers, reinforcements, anyone, to get charges on that bridge before the full weight of a German counterattack rolled north. One shot with an obsolete rifle and a prayer that British engineering from 1942 was still worth a damn. McNiece squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared. The recoil slammed into his shoulder like a freight train, driving him back against the stone wall, hard enough to crack the mortar. Pain exploded through his chest and arm, white-hot and immediate. The world tilted, and for a moment McNiece couldn't tell if he was still standing or sprawled in the mud. His ears rang with a high, piercing whine that drowned out everything else. But across the field, the German armored car lurched to a stop, smoke pouring from a hole in its front plate. McNiece forced himself upright, gasping, and reached for the second round. This was how legends started, not with heroism, but with desperation, improvisation, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that looked like courage only after you survived it. The question was whether Jake McNiece would live long enough to explain what calculated risk really meant when you were holding a weapon that could kill you almost as easily as it killed the enemy. Exact premise, word count, 1 to 198. Story: how Jake McNiece used Boy's anti-tank rifle in 1944 with calculated risk to stop an armored push. Untold. The Boy's anti-tank rifle lay in the mud like a relic from another war, which in a sense it was. Jake McNiece crouched beside it in the pre-dawn darkness, south of Sun Holland, running his hand along the cold steel barrel and wondering if desperation had finally pushed him past the edge of reason. September 19th, 1944, and Operation Market Garden was already unraveling in ways the planners back in England had never imagined. The 506th PIR had scattered across the Dutch countryside 2 nights earlier, blown off course by German flak and bad winds. The Filthy 13 landed in the worst possible spot, a flooded meadow, where half their explosives sank under 2 feet of canal water before anyone could recover them. Now McNiece sat in the ruins of a farmhouse with 7 exhausted paratroopers, staring at the only anti-armor weapon they'd managed to scrounge from a burned British supply truck. And it was 40 pounds of obsolete metal that hadn't been worth a damn since 1942. The hedgerow to their south had collapsed under artillery fire hours earlier, leaving a vehicle-width gap that opened straight toward the bridge at Sun. If German reconnaissance found it, they'd call in armor, and the entire southern approach would collapse before engineers could rig proper demolitions. McNiece's orders were simple: hold until relieved. But he had no TNT, no bazookas, no Piats, and no illusions about what hold meant when facing German half-tracks with nothing but rifles and one absurdly heavy piece of British desperation. Sergeant Ragsman leaned against the wall beside him, nursing a broken finger he'd taped to his M1 Garand. "That thing gonna work, McNasty?" McNiece picked up one of the 55 caliber rounds they'd salvaged. British stamped, 1942 manufacture, 11 rounds total in a canvas pouch that reeked of diesel. "Depends on your definition of work. Will it stop a half-track?" Might punch through the armor, might also break my shoulder and explode in my face. Ragsman grunted. So about the same odds as usual. Across the field, engines rumbled through the fog. German reconnaissance, probing the southern routes just like McNiece knew they would. They had maybe 10 minutes before those vehicles reached the gap in the hedgerow, saw the opening, and radioed back that the road to Sun was undefended. McNiece hefted the boy's rifle. It was nearly 5 feet long, weighed close to 40 pounds loaded, and was designed to be fired prone with the bipod planted and the stock braced hard against the shoulder. British anti-tank teams had abandoned them along the roads near Eindhoven, trading them for anything that stood a better chance against German armor. The recoil was legendary, strong enough to dislocate shoulders, crack ribs, or knock a man flat if he wasn't braced properly. But McNiece had built a career on doing things that weren't supposed to work. He wedged himself into the corner of the collapsed farmhouse wall, testing angles. The only position that gave him a clear shot across the field was half standing, braced against the stone with his left elbow taking most of the support. It was a terrible firing position. The recoil would drive him straight back into the wall. If he was lucky, he'd stay conscious. If he wasn't, the boys would shatter his shoulder and he'd be useless for the rest of the war. Dewey, the youngest of the squad, watched from the shadows. "Sarge, that ain't how you're supposed to fire that thing. You see a better option, kid?" Silence. The fog shifted, and McNiece caught the silhouette of the first vehicle, an SDKFZ 200-222 armored car, turret swiveling as it scanned the hedgerows. Behind it, the heavier shadow of a half-track carrying troops. They were moving slowly, cautiously, testing the route before committing a full column. McNiece loaded the first round, feeling the weight of it slide into the chamber. His hands were shaking, cold, exhaustion, and the bone-deep understanding that what he was about to do was either the smartest calculated risk of his life or the dumbest way to get himself killed. One shot, one chance to make the Germans think this route was a death trap instead of an open highway. He pressed the stock against his shoulder and sighted down the barrel at the armored car's front plate. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. 3 hours earlier, McNiece had been arguing with Lieutenant Winters about the definition of "hold your position." They'd met at a crossroads half a kilometer north of the farmhouse, where the 506th was trying to establish some kind of coherent defensive line from the chaos of the drop. Winters had maps that didn't match the ground, radios that barely worked, and orders from regiment that assumed equipment, and men had landed where they were supposed to. "We need that southern approach locked down," Winters had said, tracing a line on the map with his finger. "Engineers are coming up to demo the bridge, but they need time. Can you hold it?" McNiece had studied the terrain, the scattered reports of German probes, and the dismal inventory of what the filthy 13 actually had left. "Hold it with what, sir? We lost most of our demo gear in the drop. No bazookas, no Piats. Hell, Ragsman's holding his rifle together with bootlaces. Use what you've got. Improvise. That's what you're good at, isn't it?" The words had stung because they were true. McNiece had a reputation for pulling off impossible demolitions with whatever he could scrounge, fix, or steal. But there was a difference between improvising a bridge charge with mismatched fuses and stopping German armor with nothing but rifles and prayer. Still, he'd nodded. "Because that's what you did. You took the order, figured out how to make it work, and dealt with the consequences later. Now, crouched in the ruins, with the boy's rifle braced against the wall, McNiece understood exactly what those consequences looked like. The German armored car was less than 300 yards away now, moving slowly through the morning fog that clung to the low ground near the canal. McNiece could see the commander's hatch partially open, an officer scanning the hedgerows with binoculars, smart, cautious, looking for exactly the kind of ambush McNiece was trying to set up. Beside him, Moore whispered, "They're gonna spot the gap any second." I know. You really think that thing's gonna work? McNiece didn't answer. The truth was he had no idea. The boy's anti-tank rifle was rated to penetrate 21 millimeter of armor at 100 yards under ideal conditions. Prone position, proper bracing, fresh ammunition, trained crew. McNiece had none of those things. He was firing from an improvised stance with 1942 vintage British rounds that might have been stored in a damp truck for 2 years. The rifle's barrel was scratched and the bipod was bent. If the round tumbled, failed to penetrate, or if the vehicle's armor was thicker than the spec sheets claimed, he'd just announce their position without achieving anything. But doing nothing guaranteed failure. At least this way, he had a chance. The armored car stopped. The commander raised his binoculars, sweeping across the collapsed hedgerow. McNiece saw the moment the officer spotted the gap. The sudden pause, the slight lean forward, the beginning of a gesture toward the radio operator inside the turret. McNiece squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared like artillery in a phone booth. The recoil hit him with the force of a charging bull, driving him back against the stone wall, hard enough to crack the mortar and knock the wind from his lungs. Pain exploded through his right shoulder and chest, white-hot and immediate. And for a fraction of a second, McNiece couldn't tell if he was still standing or sprawled in the mud with a dislocated shoulder and shattered ribs. But through the ringing in his ears and the haze of pain, he saw the armored car lurch to a stop. Smoke poured from a ragged hole in its front plate, just below the driver's vision slit. The commander dropped his binoculars and disappeared into the turret. The half-track behind it immediately reversed, tracks churning mud as it backed away from the hedgerow. Ragsman stared at the smoking vehicle. "Holy hell, you actually hit it!" McNiece forced himself upright, gasping, his right arm hanging nearly useless at his side. "Load another round." "Your shoulder." "Load it." The second shot broke something. McNiece felt it the moment the rifle fired, a wet, tearing sensation deep in his shoulder that sent waves of nausea through his gut. The round punched through the side armor of the half-track as it tried to maneuver around the disabled armored car, and the vehicle lurched to a stop, crew bailing out into the ditches along the road. But McNiece barely registered the hit. He collapsed against the wall, the boy's rifle clattering to the ground beside him, his right arm completely useless now. The pain was different from anything he'd felt before. Not the sharp crack of broken bone, but the deep, grinding wrongness of torn muscle and damaged joints. Dewey caught him before he fell. "Sarge, you gotta stop." "Got 9 rounds left," McNiece managed through gritted teeth. "They come back with tanks. Then we'll deal with it. You can't even hold the damn rifle." But McNiece knew how this worked. The Germans would probe once, get bloodied, pull back to reassess. Then they'd return with more armor, more infantry, and a plan that assumed the defenders had proper anti-tank weapons. The longer McNiece could maintain that illusion, the longer it would take them to realize the southern route was actually wide open. News from the northern sectors wasn't helping. A runner had come through an hour before dawn with reports from the 502nd. Heavy German counterattacks near Best, multiple bridges blown before they could be captured, the entire Market Garden timetable slipping further behind with each passing hour. The road to Arnhem was supposed to be a clean shot north through Sonn, Wegel and Uden. Instead, it was turning into a series of desperate holding actions at crossroads and canal bridges, with scattered airborne units trying to block German armor, using weapons that were never designed for the job. McNiece looked at the boy's rifle lying in the mud beside him. The barrel was still smoking. The stock had a fresh crack running through the wood where the recoil had driven it against the wall. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel something grinding in the joint that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. Moore picked up the rifle, examining it. "This thing's gonna fall apart if we keep firing it." "So will I," McNiece said. "But we're both gonna last long enough to make them think twice about this route." Ragsman was watching the tree line across the field where the German crews had taken cover. "They're calling it in right now." radioing back about anti-tank defenses, proper positions, maybe even requesting artillery support before they try again. Good. Let them think we're dug in with bazookas and a full platoon. Every hour they spend planning their next move is another hour for engineers to get charges on that bridge. But the calculation was shifting in McNiece's head. He'd bought time with 2 shots. The Germans would regroup, bring up heavier armor, maybe even infantry support. When they came back, they'd come hard and fast, and McNiece would have maybe one more chance to convince them the position was too strong to rush. One more shot with a shoulder that couldn't take the recoil. One more shot with a rifle that was literally falling apart. One more shot to hold a gap in a hedgerow that was supposed to be supported by a full squad with proper equipment, not 7 exhausted paratroopers and a piece of obsolete British hardware. The fog was starting to lift, revealing the full extent of the Dutch countryside around Sun. Flat fields crisscrossed with drainage ditches, narrow roads elevated above the floodplains, churches and farmhouses that had become reference points for American and German units alike. Somewhere north of here, the bridge at Sun was either being rigged for demolition or already blown. Somewhere south, German armor was regrouping for another push. And in the middle, Jake McNiece sat with a broken shoulder and a calculated risk that had worked exactly twice. The question was whether it would work a 3rd time, or if the next shot would be the one that killed him before the Germans ever got the chance. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The Germans returned at noon with a Panzer IV. McNiece had known it was coming the moment the morning reconnaissance failed. The smoking hulks of the armored car and half-track sat in the field like tombstones, visible for kilometers across the flat Dutch landscape. Any competent German commander would assume the position was defended by at least a platoon with multiple anti-tank weapons. They'd bring enough armor to overwhelm that kind of defense. The Panzer came up the road slowly, turret traversing back and forth as it scanned for threats. Behind it, McNiece could see infantry moving through the ditches, probably a full platoon, maybe more, using the tank as mobile cover. This wasn't reconnaissance anymore. This was a deliberate assault to clear the route. Ragsman had taken over the boy's rifle, bracing it across a pile of rubble with Moore helping to hold it steady. McNiece couldn't fire anymore. His right shoulder was swollen to twice its normal size, and he couldn't raise his arm above waist height. But he could spot, and he could make the calls that kept his men alive. "Front plate's too thick," McNiece said, watching the Panzer through a gap in the wall. "You're not punching through that with a 55 caliber round. So what do we do? Wait for a side shot. If it turns, you might get the suspension or the tracks. Won't kill it, but it'll slow them down." Dewey was watching the infantry. "They're spreading out. Looks like they're planning to flank us. Let them try. The canals on our left and the flooded fields on our right are too soft for vehicles. They'll have to come straight at us or swing wide enough that we'll have time to fall back." But McNiece knew falling back wasn't really an option. Once they abandoned this position, the Germans would roll straight through to the bridge. The engineers hadn't had enough time. The explosives were still being positioned. If McNiece pulled out now, Market Garden's southern anchor would collapse before it was even properly set. The Panzer stopped about 400 yards out, and McNiece felt his stomach drop. That was outside the boy's effective range. The German commander knew what he was doing, staying back far enough to make anti-tank weapons useless while his infantry maneuvered around the flanks. "We got a problem," Ragsman muttered. "Yeah." McNiece watched the infantry working through the ditches, moving with the discipline of veterans. They'd pin the farmhouse position with rifle and machine gun fire, while the Panzer provided overwatch. Then they'd close in from multiple directions until the paratroopers had to either surrender or die in place, unless McNiece could make the Germans believe the risk was still too high. "Give me the rifle," he said. Ragsman stared at him. "Your shoulder's destroyed." "I know. Give it to me anyway." Moore helped position the boys across a more solid section of rubble, with McNiece lying nearly prone behind it. The position was better than the half-standing stance he'd used before, but it still wasn't proper. The rifle's weight pressed down on his damaged shoulder, and even the slight movement of getting into position sent lightning bolts of pain through his chest. But he'd done the math. At 400 yards, the boys couldn't penetrate the Panzer's armor, but it could scare the hell out of the crew if a round hit the turret or hull. German tank doctrine emphasized protecting the vehicle. Crews were trained to button up and withdraw if they took anti-tank fire. They couldn't immediately suppress. If McNiece could hit the Panzer hard enough to make them think there were still functional anti-tank weapons in the farmhouse, they might pull back long enough for the engineers to finish the bridge demolition. One shot, one chance to bluff with a weapon that couldn't actually do what the Germans would assume it could. McNiece, sighted on the Panzer's turret, took a breath and squeezed the trigger. The recoil drove him back against the rubble with enough force to knock him unconscious for maybe 3 seconds. When his vision cleared, the Panzer was reversing, smoke grenades popping to obscure its retreat, and the German infantry was falling back toward the cover of the ditches. Ragsman was staring at him with something between awe and horror. "You hit the turret. I saw the spark. They think we've got a goddamn 57mm gun or something." McNiece tried to push himself up and couldn't. His right arm refused to respond. His chest felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it, but across the field, the Germans were pulling back, reorganizing, buying the engineers more time. "How many rounds left?" he asked. 8, Moore said quietly. "But Sarge, you fire that thing again, and you're gonna kill yourself before the Germans get the chance." McNiece closed his eyes, listening to the sound of the Panzer's engine fading into the distance. Somewhere north of here, engineers were placing charges on the bridge at Sun. Somewhere south, German commanders were revising their plans based on reports of heavy anti-tank defenses at a farmhouse that held nothing but 7 paratroopers and a broken rifle. This was the secret the after-action reports would never capture, not the heroism, but the calculated gamble that the enemy would see what they expected to see rather than what was actually there. And the price McNiece was paying to maintain that illusion. The bridge at Sun blew at 1400 hours, and McNiece heard it from 3 kilometers away. A deep, rolling thunder that shook the ground and sent flocks of birds scattering from the trees. He was lying in the farmhouse cellar by then, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Dewey tried to stabilize his shoulder with strips of parachute silk and whatever medical supplies they had left. The engineers had made it. The bridge was down. The southern approach to Sun was cut, and German armor would have to find another way north or spend days repairing the span under Allied artillery fire. Mission accomplished, but what McNiece kept thinking about, in the moments when the pain receded enough to think at all, was that none of the official reports would tell the real story. They'd write that a squad from the 506th PIR held a critical approach using captured enemy weapons and improvised tactics. They'd mention the destroyed German vehicles, the delayed counterattack, the successful demolition. Some of it might even make it into the regimental history, cleaned up and simplified until it sounded almost reasonable. What they wouldn't write about was the calculation McNiece had made in the mud, that his shoulder was worth less than the time his squad could buy, that a piece of obsolete British equipment could be more valuable as a bluff than as an actual weapon, that the Germans would commit to assumptions about American defensive capabilities based on 2 lucky shots and one that was pure theater. They wouldn't write about the moment, after the first shot, when McNiece realized the recoil had torn something in his shoulder that probably wouldn't heal right, or the decision to fire anyway, knowing each subsequent shot was compounding the damage. Or the final shot at the Panzer, which wasn't about penetrating armor at all, but about creating the appearance of strength from a position that was falling apart. Ragsman came down into the cellar, his face grim. "Medics are coming up from the battalion aid station. Should be here in 20 minutes. The bridge? Down. Engineers finished just before you passed out. Jerry's pulling back to regroup." McNiece tried to nod, and gasped as pain shot through his chest. "Good. Is it?" Ragsman sat on an overturned crate, studying him. "You tore up your shoulder for a bridge that was going to blow anyway. We could have pulled back, let the engineers handle it. And if the Germans pushed through before the engineers finished, then they'd have blown it anyway, demolished the whole damn thing with Germans on top of it if they had to." But McNiece knew that wasn't quite true. Combat engineers needed time to position charges properly, to calculate loads and fusing sequences, to make sure the structure would fail in exactly the right way. Rush them, and the demolition might be incomplete. Partial bridge collapses could be repaired in hours instead of days. The time McNiece had bought, 3 hours of German caution, reorganization and revised planning, had been the difference between a controlled demolition and a desperate gamble under fire. The secret was that McNiece had known from the second shot onward that he was destroying his shoulder for marginal gains. Each subsequent shot had bought maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour. Whether those hours would matter in the larger scope of Market Garden was impossible to know in the moment. But that was the calculation every NCO made in every firefight. Trade pain now for possibilities later, and hope like hell the possibilities were worth it. Winters came down an hour later, after the medics had splinted McNiece's shoulder and pumped him full of enough morphine to make the edges of the world soft and blurry. The lieutenant crouched beside him, looking tired and older than McNiece remembered. "Hell of a job, Jake. Did what you asked, sir. You did more than that. The Germans thought we had a full anti-tank platoon dug in down here. Bought us half a day of breathing room." McNiece wanted to tell him the truth, that it was smoke and mirrors, that the boy's rifle was falling apart, that the last shot hadn't even been capable of damaging the Panzer. But what would be the point? The mission succeeded. The bridge was down. The cost was just one demolished NCO with a shoulder that would never fully work again. "Write it up however makes sense, sir." Winters studied him for a long moment, and McNiece wondered if the lieutenant could see through the morphine haze to the calculation underneath. Then Winters nodded and stood. "Get some rest. We'll get you back to a proper aid station once the road's clear." After he left, Ragsman leaned against the cellar wall and pulled out a pack of cigarettes. "He's going to put you in for a medal, you know." "Don't want a medal." "What do you want?" McNiece closed his eyes, feeling the morphine pull him towards sleep. "Want my shoulder back. Want this war over. Want to stop making calls about what parts of myself are worth trading for 20 meters of blown bridge." But that was the secret they'd never put in the report. That heroism wasn't about fearlessness or even courage. It was about doing the math on what you could afford to lose and hoping you'd calculated correctly. They evacuated McNiece to a field hospital near Eindhoven that night, bouncing along rutted roads in an ambulance that had seen better days. His shoulder was immobilized, packed with sulfur powder and wrapped tight enough to restrict breathing. The morphine kept the worst of the pain at bay, but he could feel the damage underneath, the grinding sensation in the joint, the way his arm hung at a slightly wrong angle, the certainty that this injury would define the rest of his life. The first twist came 3 days later, when Ragsman visited with news from the front. Market Garden was falling apart. The British airborne at Arnhem had been cut off and destroyed. The entire operation, which was supposed to end the war by Christmas, had devolved into a desperate battle to hold a narrow corridor through German-occupied Holland. The bridge at Sun, the one McNiece had destroyed his shoulder to protect, had been rebuilt by combat engineers within 48 hours and was now carrying Allied supply trucks north. "So we blew it for nothing?" McNiece asked. "Not nothing. Delayed the German counterattack long enough for us to consolidate the drop zones. Without that delay, they might have hit us while we were still scattered." Ragsman lit a cigarette, his broken finger still splintered. "But yeah, the bridge didn't stay down long." McNiece stared at the ceiling of the hospital tent, processing that information through the morphine fog. He'd gambled his shoulder on buying time for a demolition that had been strategic for less than 2 days. In the larger scope of the war, it was a footnote, a minor action in a failed offensive. something that might get 3 sentences in a regimental history if it got mentioned at all. The second twist came a week later, in the form of a recommendation for the Bronze Star that Lieutenant Winters had submitted. McNiece read it in the hospital bed, his right arm still immobilized. Sergeant McNiece, despite inadequate equipment and heavy enemy pressure, employed captured British anti-tank weaponry to successfully delay German armored reconnaissance, enabling engineers to complete critical demolitions. His actions exemplified the initiative and courage expected of airborne forces. It was accurate. It was also completely bloodless. Nothing about the calculated risk of using a weapon that could kill him as easily as the enemy. Nothing about the way each shot had compounded damage to his shoulder until the joint was permanently compromised. Nothing about the bluff in the final shot, or the cold mathematics of trading body parts for borrowed time. But that was how legends worked. They took the messy, painful reality and compressed it into something clean enough to write on a citation or tell at a reunion. The boy's anti-tank rifle became captured British anti-tank weaponry. The torn shoulder and cracked ribs became despite inadequate equipment. The desperate gamble became initiative and courage. McNiece signed the paperwork and handed it back to the nurse without comment. The morphine wore off gradually over the following weeks as his shoulder began the slow, incomplete process of healing. The doctors told him he'd regain maybe 60% function if he was lucky. Physical therapy would help, but the damage was too severe for a full recovery. He'd never have the same strength or mobility in his right arm. Small tasks, lifting heavy loads, throwing grenades, steadying a rifle for precise shots, would be difficult or impossible for the rest of his life. But the real cost revealed itself slowly in ways the doctors never mentioned. The way he flinched at sudden loud noises, his body remembering the boy's rifle's recoil, the nightmares where he was trapped behind the farmhouse wall, firing round after round with the rifle falling apart in his hands. The quiet moments when he'd catch himself calculating angles and trajectories, wondering if there had been a better way to position the weapon, a smarter bluff to run, a choice that might have achieved the same result without destroying his shoulder. The Filthy 13 moved on without him. They jumped into Bastogne in December, held the perimeter during the siege, and added more stories to their legend. McNiece heard about it in the hospital, reading letters from ragsmen that described the cold, the shortages, the desperate fighting in the Ardennes. Part of him wanted to be there. Most of him was grateful he wasn't. He was discharged in early 1945, sent home with a medical retirement and a shoulder that ached whenever the weather changed. The Bronze Star arrived in the mail 3 months after the war ended, accompanied by a formal letter thanking him for his service. He put it in a drawer and didn't look at it for 20 years. What stayed with him wasn't the medal or the citation. It was the memory of that moment in the farmhouse, calculating how many shots his shoulder could take and choosing to fire anyway. The knowledge that he'd made the right call, that the time he bought had mattered, even if only marginally, didn't make the pain any less real. Neither did knowing that hundreds of other paratroopers had made similar calculations throughout the war, trading pieces of themselves for objectives that were sometimes strategic and sometimes just footnotes. In 1982, a military historian tracked him down in Oklahoma and asked about the boy's rifle incident. McNiece tried to explain the calculation, the risk, the way courage looked different from the inside than it did in after-action reports. The historian nodded and took notes, but when the book came out 2 years later, the story had been cleaned up again. Heroic stand, improvised anti-tank defense, delayed German counterattack, all true. None of it capturing what it had actually felt like to fire a weapon that was tearing your body apart with each shot, knowing that stopping would mean abandoning the men and missions depending on you. The real story, McNiece realized, was one that couldn't be told in full. Because it wasn't about what he'd done with the boy's rifle. It was about all the small, impossible calculations every soldier made in moments no one else would ever see. The choice between terrible options, the gap between the legend and the memory, the weight of knowing that sometimes courage meant destroying yourself in increments to buy strangers a few more hours. He still had the boy's rifle, in a sense. It lived in his right shoulder, in the grinding sensation that never quite went away, in the weather ache that came with autumn storms, in the weakness that made simple tasks difficult, and reminded him that some prices were paid over decades, not days. But when people asked about the war, McNiece usually just said he'd jumped into Holland and done his job. The rest was between him, his shoulder, and the 7 men who'd watched him make the calculation and never once suggested he'd chosen wrong. Udil, if this story reminded you that behind every medal and mission report there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.